Hollywood's golden age was built on glamour, fantasy, and carefully constructed illusions. But behind the silver screen's dazzling glow lived real human beings, fragile, tormented, and often completely alone. The studios that made these stars into gods were the same institutions that destroyed them. When the breakdowns came, when the darkness became impossible to hide, powerful men made powerful decisions. These stars didn't just fade away. Many were quietly, deliberately, and sometimes forcibly removed from public life, locked behind asylum walls while Hollywood pretended they never existed. These are their stories. Number 1. Frances Farmer, America's most brutalized star. Frances Farmer was everything Hollywood wanted: breathtaking beauty, raw talent, and an intelligence that burned so brightly it made powerful men deeply uncomfortable. Born in Seattle, Washington in 1913, Farmer arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1930s with a fierce, independent spirit that the studio system simply could not tolerate. She challenged directors, refused to play the obedient starlet, spoke openly about politics during a time when that was considered dangerous, and refused to kowtow to the controlling machinery of Paramount Pictures. In a world that demanded compliance, Frances Farmer demanded respect, and Hollywood never forgave her for it. Her decline was methodical and devastating. After a series of public incidents, including an altercation with a hairdresser and a drunk driving arrest, the machinery of destruction began turning against her in earnest. Her own mother, perhaps most shockingly of all, signed the papers that had Frances committed. Between 1943 and 1950, Farmer was in and out of psychiatric institutions, including the notorious Western State Hospital in Washington. The conditions she endured there were barbaric by any modern standard. There are credible accounts, and her own memoirs support this, that she was subjected to insulin shock therapy, hydrotherapy involving near drowning in ice-cold water, and repeated sexual assaults by staff and patients alike. Most controversially, it has long been alleged that Frances Farmer was subjected to a transorbital lobotomy, the horrifying ice pick procedure performed through the eye socket, though historians continue to debate this. What is not debated is that the woman who emerged from those institutions was a ghost of the luminous, ferocious talent who had entered them. She eventually returned to public life in the 1950s as a television host in Indianapolis, but she never recaptured her former greatness. Frances Farmer died in 1970 from esophageal cancer. She was 56. Hollywood had consumed her entirely. Number 2. Gene Tierney. The most beautiful face, the most hidden pain. Gene Tierney was once called the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, a title that carried tremendous weight in an industry obsessed with surfaces. Her luminous performance in Laura, 1944, made her an icon, and her ethereal, almost otherworldly beauty placed her firmly among the elite stars of the 1940s. But behind those unforgettable green eyes lived a woman in profound psychological pain, and the industry she served so faithfully showed her absolutely no mercy when that pain became visible. Tierney's suffering had deep personal roots. During World War II, she met a young female fan at a military event who was recovering from rubella, German measles. The woman broke quarantine to attend, and weeks later, Tierney discovered she was pregnant. Her daughter, Daria, was born with severe physical and cognitive disabilities directly caused by rubella exposure. The guilt that Tierney carried was absolutely crushing, and it eventually fractured her mental health completely. She was diagnosed with severe depression and bipolar disorder, and throughout the 1950s, she underwent a staggering 27 rounds of electroconvulsive therapy at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. What makes Tierney's story particularly heartbreaking is the voluntary yet desperate nature of her institutionalization. She checked herself into facilities multiple times, genuinely seeking help, only to emerge each time with her memory partially destroyed by the shock treatments. The electroconvulsive therapy of that era was nothing like the more refined procedures used today. It was violent, imprecise, and frequently left patients with significant memory loss. Tierney described forgetting entire years of her life and losing the ability to recall lines while filming. The studios quietly reduced her workload, then quietly moved on. She eventually found stability in her second marriage and later wrote a remarkably candid memoir, Self-Portrait, in 1979. Gene Tierney died in 1991. Her story remains a testament to suffering politely hidden in plain sight. Number 3. Clara Bow, the IT girl who lost everything. She was the original It girl, the symbol of 1920s freedom, sexuality, and joy. Clara Bow's vivacious energy leapt off the screen in ways that simply hadn't existed before her, and audiences adored her with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. At the height of her fame, she received more fan mail than any other star in Hollywood, upward of 45,000 letters per week. But the machine that manufactured her celebrity was the same machine that ground her into dust, and Clara Bow paid a devastating psychological price for every frame of film she ever appeared in. Bow's early life was catastrophically unstable. She grew up in crushing Brooklyn poverty with a mentally ill mother who held a knife to her throat while she slept, and a father who was largely absent. The childhood trauma never truly left her. As her fame exploded, she developed severe anxiety, insomnia, and what would today be recognized as complex PTSD. She stuttered during the transition to sound films, and a ruthless press corps, along with a gossip columnist named Luella Parsons, amplified every stumble into a national scandal. Stories about her personal life, many fabricated or wildly exaggerated, destroyed her reputation systematically and deliberately. By the early 1930s, Bow had completely retreated from public life. She married actor Rex Bell and moved to a Nevada ranch, desperately trying to escape. But the breakdowns continued. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a catch-all diagnosis of that era that often covered everything from depression to trauma responses, and spent significant periods in private sanitariums. Her children later spoke about a mother who was frequently unrecognizable, trapped in cycles of breakdown and fragile recovery. Clara Bow spent her final decades in semi-isolation, a woman the world had forgotten. She died in 1965 of a heart attack, alone in her Woodland Hills home. She was 60. Number 4. Veronica Lake, the peekaboo blonde who vanished. Veronica Lake's cascading blonde hair falling over one eye created one of Hollywood's most iconic images. The peekaboo look was so powerfully influential that the U.S. government literally asked her to change it during World War II because female factory workers were copying the style and catching their hair in industrial machinery. That kind of cultural impact was extraordinary. Yet, within a decade of her peak fame, Veronica Lake had completely disappeared, and the circumstances of her disappearance were deeply tragic. Lake struggled with alcoholism from relatively early in her career, a struggle that Hollywood studios initially managed and concealed with the same practiced efficiency they applied to everything inconvenient. But her behavior became increasingly erratic. Her marriages collapsed in spectacular fashion, and Paramount, which had built her mystique so carefully, dropped her without ceremony. By the 1950s, she was working in summer stock theater. By the 1960s, she was discovered working as a cocktail waitress in New York, a revelation that became a brief, humiliating media spectacle that served the public's appetite for fallen star narratives. What received far less attention was the serious nature of Lake's mental illness. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent time in psychiatric care facilities that she was never truly open about during her lifetime. The combination of alcohol dependency, untreated mental illness, and complete financial ruin created a life of genuine misery beneath the occasional nostalgic spotlight. Lake attempted a comeback with a memoir and some television appearances in the late 1960s, but her health was destroyed. Veronica Lake died in 1973 of acute hepatitis, complicated by years of heavy drinking. She was 50 years old. The peekaboo girl had been hiding in plain sight. From pain no one bothered to treat. Number 5, Mary Miles Minter, buried alive by scandal. Mary Miles Minter was positioned to be the successor to Mary Pickford, the next great sweetheart of American silent cinema. With golden ringlets, an angelic face, and genuine acting ability, Minter seemed destined for enduring superstardom. Instead, she was one of Hollywood's most complete destructions, swallowed by a murder scandal that ended her career before she was 25 and triggered a psychological collapse from which she never recovered. The murder of director William Desmond Taylor in 1922 was one of Hollywood's first great unsolved crimes, and Mary Miles Minter was directly entangled in its fallout. Love letters she had written to Taylor were discovered by police. Her mother, the controlling and monstrous Charlotte Shelby, who many historians believe was actually responsible for Taylor's murder, had long dominated every aspect of Minter's life and career. When the scandal broke, the studio system immediately and completely abandoned Minter to protect itself. Her contract was terminated, her films were pulled from distribution, and she was erased with a thoroughness that was stunning even by Hollywood standards. The psychological destruction was total. Minter retreated from public life almost immediately, becoming increasingly reclusive and paranoid. She was described by neighbors and acquaintances as deeply disturbed, living in isolation and struggling with what would today be recognized as severe anxiety disorder and paranoid depression. She was never formally institutionalized in a publicly acknowledged way, but accounts of her mental state from the 1930s through 1960s paint a picture of a woman living in a kind of private asylum of her own making. Mary Miles Minter died in 1984 at age 82, having spent roughly 6 decades in nearly complete self-imposed isolation. Hollywood had buried her alive, and the burial had been permanent. Number 6, Lupe Velez, the Mexican Spitfire's desperate final act. Lupe Velez burned with a ferocious vitality that earned her the nickname the Mexican Spitfire, a moniker she both embraced and was diminished by simultaneously. Her energy was electric, her comedic timing was exceptional, and her dramatic range was far greater than Hollywood ever allowed her to fully demonstrate. But Velez existed at the intersection of several forms of discrimination. As a Latina woman in an industry that reduced her to exotic stereotypes, and the psychological toll of that constant diminishment was immense and ultimately unsurvivable. Velez's personal life was turbulent in ways that the press covered with gleeful cruelty. Her passionate, violently volatile relationship with Johnny Weissmuller was treated as entertainment. Her subsequent relationships were catalogued and mocked. When she found herself pregnant and unmarried in 1944, at a time when that carried enormous social stigma, the emotional collapse was complete. She carefully arranged her room, filled it with flowers and candles, and took her own life with sleeping pills on December 14, 1944. She was 36 years old. What the Hollywood machine had never addressed, never treated, and never taken seriously were the very real signs of severe depression and psychological crisis that Velez had been displaying for years. The studios that profited from her enormous energy saw her distress as dramatic temperament rather than medical emergency. Her institutionalization never came, because no one in power ever took her pain seriously enough to intervene meaningfully. What she needed was genuine psychiatric care and human compassion. What she received was exploitation and mockery. Her death note was addressed to her unborn child's father, Harold Ramond. It spoke of a woman utterly abandoned by the world that had first devoured and then discarded her. Number 7. Peg Entwistle, the Hollywood sign's most haunting ghost. Peg Entwistle's story is perhaps the most symbolically devastating in all of Hollywood history. A talented British stage actress who had made genuine inroads on Broadway, Entwistle came to Hollywood in 1932 with legitimate credentials and real hope. RKO Pictures gave her a role in 13 Women, and then proceeded to cut most of her scenes. The rejection was crushing for a woman who had already endured significant personal hardships, including the abandonment by a violently abusive first husband. On September 18, 1932, Peg Entwistle climbed the Hollywood sign, then spelled Hollywoodland, and leapt from the letter H. She was 24 years old. In the most literal possible sense, Hollywood had become the instrument of her destruction. She left behind a note that said simply, "I am afraid I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain." What makes Entwistle's story relevant to this broader narrative is what it reveals about the complete absence of any mental health support system for struggling performers during this era. The signs of her deterioration were visible to those around her. She was staying with her uncle, deeply withdrawn, showing all the indicators of severe depressive crisis. But in 1932, there were no studio counselors, no mental health resources, no safety nets of any kind. Institutions existed, but they were places of punishment and containment rather than healing. Peg Entwistle fell through every crack that existed because the cracks were everywhere, and no one in the industry had any interest in catching her. The cruelest postscript, a letter arrived at her uncle's home after her death, offering her a starring role. Number 8. Montgomery Clift, the longest suicide in Hollywood history. Elizabeth Taylor, who loved Montgomery Clift as deeply as she loved anyone in her remarkable life, called him the most beautiful man alive. He was also one of the most gifted actors of his generation, a pioneer of the method approach, whose work in A Place in the Sun, From Here to Eternity, and The Misfits represented some of the finest American screen acting ever committed to film. But Montgomery Clift was a man at war with himself on multiple devastating fronts, and Hollywood offered him no refuge from that war. Clift was gay in an era when homosexuality was not only socially unacceptable, but legally dangerous. The psychological burden of concealment, of manufacturing a public persona entirely disconnected from his authentic self, was enormous and relentless. He managed it with alcohol and prescription drugs, a combination that became increasingly destructive throughout the 1950s. Then, in May 1956, Clift was in a near-fatal car accident while leaving a party at Elizabeth Taylor's home. His face was shattered. Taylor famously reached into his throat and removed broken teeth to prevent him from choking to death. The accident marked a clear before and after in Clift's life. He was never institutionalized in the formal sense, but the psychiatric facilities and rehabilitation centers he cycled through during the late 1950s and early 1960s amounted to the same thing: desperate interventions that addressed symptoms while the underlying causes remained untouchable in that cultural moment. The medication combinations he was prescribed were staggering and ultimately contributed to his death. Montgomery Clift died in 1966 of a heart attack. He was 45. His biographer, Patricia Bosworth, famously described the final decade of his life as the longest suicide in Hollywood history. It was a precise and heartbreaking description. Number 9. Joan Bennett, Scandal, Shooting, and Psychological Exile. Joan Bennett was a major star of the 1930s and 1940s, a sophisticated, darkly glamorous actress who thrived particularly in film noir. Her performances in Fritz Lang, films like Scarlet Street and The Woman in the Window established her as one of the genre's defining presences. Her career was flourishing, her talent undeniable. Then her husband, producer Walter Wanger, shot her agent Jennings Lang in a parking lot in 1951, believing, apparently incorrectly, that Lang and Bennett were having an affair. The scandal that followed was catastrophic. While Bennett herself was the victim of her husband's violent jealousy, Hollywood treated her as a pariah. She was blacklisted not through any formal mechanism, but through the quiet, devastating withdrawal of opportunities that had previously been readily available. The psychological impact of being effectively punished for someone else's crime, of being a victim of violence who was then treated as a perpetrator of scandal, was profound and lasting. Bennett's mental health deteriorated significantly during this period. She continued working in theater and eventually in soap operas, most notably Dark Shadows, in the late 1960s, but she never recaptured the film career that had been taken from her. The psychiatric treatment she sought during the 1950s was conducted with complete discretion, the kind of careful secrecy that wealthy and well-connected figures could purchase. But the treatment, whatever form it took, was never fully adequate for the depth of the betrayal and professional destruction she had experienced. Joan Bennett continued working with considerable dignity for decades, eventually dying in 1990 at age 80. But the career that should have been, the one that was taken from her by violence and Hollywood's spectacular hypocrisy, haunts film history permanently. Number 10. Vivien Leigh. The genius the illness consumed. Vivien Leigh was one of the most extraordinarily gifted actresses in the history of cinema. 2 Academy Awards for Gone with the Wind and A Streetcar Named Desire represent her formal achievement, but they don't capture the electric specificity of her talent, the way she could communicate entire interior worlds with a single shift of expression. She was also, from at least her mid-20s onward, living with severe bipolar disorder at a time when that condition was not understood, not properly treated, and deeply stigmatized. Leigh's manic episodes were ferocious. She was reportedly capable of going without sleep for days, becoming sexually uninhibited and verbally savage in ways completely contrary to her normal personality. Her depressive crashes were equally extreme, leaving her entirely unable to function. The electroconvulsive therapy she received, against her will on multiple occasions, was the bluntest possible instrument applied to the most delicate possible mind. Her husband, Laurence Olivier, whom she loved desperately and who loved her in return, was ultimately unable to sustain the marriage against the relentless pressure of her illness. Their divorce in 1960 broke her completely. The periods she spent in psychiatric facilities, including Netherne Hospital in Surrey, were periods of genuine institutional confinement, where she was subjected to treatments that today would be considered abusive. Between episodes, she continued to work, to dazzle audiences, to demonstrate a talent that illness could diminish but never fully extinguish. But the illness always returned, and the treatments of the era guaranteed that each return was accompanied by additional neurological damage. Vivien Leigh died in 1967 of tuberculosis, alone in her London apartment. She was 53. The world lost her far too soon, and the industry that benefited most from her genius did the least to preserve her. These are not simply sad stories from a distant era. They are indictments of an industry that manufactured human beings into products, extracted every possible unit of value from them, and discarded what remained without ceremony or conscience. The asylums and sanitariums that held these stars were, in many cases, extensions of the same system of control that had always governed their lives. Hollywood's golden age was golden only for those who held the power, for those who provided the magic, the real, human, fragile people behind the illusions. It was often something much darker. Remember their names. Honor their reality.